the newsagents.
Was it bad? Yeah, it was pretty awful. If you're a Conservative and thinking, do we have any chance of winning the next general election? Yes, there were little glimpses of sunlight for Conservatives in a few places. But do they tell us anything about the coming general election, when surely the narrative after last night is that Labour seem well on course towards victory?
We're going to be taking you through these results and explaining how it can be that while these elections, like all the elections we've had over the past few years, show us that Labour do seem to be on course to form the next government, that there is a danger that the Tory party not only lose but get wiped out, but at the same time it can be that there are just a few little clouds on the horizon for the Labour Party, for political troubles, not just for the general election, but for the politics of the next Parliament as well. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
It's Emily.
And once upon a time, you would do the aftermath of a local council election. Friday morning, you'd know everything. It is now Friday, 2:00 in the afternoon, and we know some things, and there are still a lot more to come tomorrow. What we do know is that Labour, if this is a benchmark for how well they're going to do in a general election, have a lot of cause to feel satisfied, although some little clouds in the sky, which we'll come to. For the Tories, it was pretty dismal. And if you're Rishi Sunak, you just go around saying, Harlow, Houchin, Harlow, Houchin, Harlow, Houchin. Because in Harlow, in Essex, Conservatives held on. And Ben Houchin, the mayor of Tees Valley, also won, and won pretty convincingly. But again, the question is, how much was that down to the Conservative Party? How much was that down to the individual Ben Houchin, who was almost running independent of the Conservative Party?
Yeah. I mean, Ben Houchin actually forgot to wear his blue rosette to the count. And when he was asked whether he was trying to come across as a non-Conservative, he just said, oh no, I just forgot. But I think if you're one of the Tory pundits, commentators, MPs doing the rounds today, then you are trying to make the focus of the public as narrow as you possibly can. So it is just, as you say, John, on what happened in that Tees Valley mayoralty. And whenever somebody talks about the councils they've lost, the seats they've lost, we don't know the full tally yet because we've only had between a third and half of them through so far, but they just want to point to this talismanic win, or rather a hold, of Ben Houchin, who gained 72% of the vote last time round, has gone down this time round, but actually still managed to make more than the first time. And in a perfect Conservative world, they just say, oh, stop talking about everything else. Just look at Ben. He's done brilliantly. Just stop talking about all the other stuff and really trying to keep your attention on that one win of the night.
Yeah, we should think first maybe about the council election, because as we were saying earlier in the week before we get to the mayoralties, in many, many ways, for all sorts of reasons we can discuss, the council election results, and indeed the by-election result in Blackpool South, which I think there is a danger of overlooking, are more indicative, probably, of where we're heading for the general election, which is ultimately why most people are particularly interested in these election results. And what is interesting about these results in particular, I think the ones that we have so far sat down at 2:00 on Friday afternoon, is that they are definitely at the lower end of expectations for the Conservative Party. They're basically losing on average about 50% of the seats that they're standing in, of the 1,000 or so that they were up for in this election cycle. And in particular, Labour are doing very well, and this is something that I know from conversations with Labour sources they are very pleased about. They are doing well in exactly the sort of places that they need to win in a general election. Just before we came and sat down, news came in from Swindon, for example. Absolutely two classic kind of bellwether seats in Swindon, exactly the sort of seats you need to win if you're going to get a majority for either the Conservatives or Labour. They've now got their biggest majority on that council since the 1990s. They're doing well overnight. They won Redditch Council, again, similar sort of thing. Their vote is proving to be very efficiently distributed, and what they think that where they are putting resources in particular, Milton Keynes just come in as I'm sat here now, they think that where they are putting in resources and the get out the vote operation is proving particularly successful. These are absolutely central questions for a general election outcome.
And the other thing that I thought was interesting about overnight, on this podcast, you may have heard us at times talking about our heroic figures since we launched the podcast, who we put on Mount Rushmore, the sort of Boris Johnsons and Liz Truss, because they're always so good for business. What we've never talked about on this podcast is Rushmore Council and Rushmore Borough Council, which takes in Farnborough and Aldershot in Hampshire, also turning Labour, which is one of those places that, the start of my career, I worked in Hampshire. I mean, you'd have never said Labour Aldershot or Labour Farnborough. And that again is showing that they are making gains across the country.
Add into that Norwich, Hartlepool, Thurrock, all places that they need to make advances in a general election.
And just one other striking thing that I've just seen is that you now have a situation that on councils in the big cities, so let's say Sheffield joins Liverpool and Manchester in having not a single Tory councillor on them at all. So they've almost become no-go zones for the Conservative Party.
When we were talking in the week to Luke Trill, our pollster from More in Common, he was saying, watch what happens in the East Midlands, because this is a brand new mayoralty. In other words, it doesn't have an incumbent, it doesn't have a pattern of voting. And he thought this would be a pretty critical place for us to keep an eye on. And sure enough, in the last few minutes, it has just been called for Labour. Claire Ward has won that over Ben Bradley. And why this is so interesting is, A, it doesn't have the big personalities that we were talking about in other mayoralties, the places like the West Midlands with Andy Street or Ben Houchin in Tees Valley. We don't really know what this will look like in a sort of personality-shaped mayoralty yet. But the other reason is that it covers a 12 parliamentary ward area. In other words, there are critical seats in this part of the world that Labour will now start feeling pretty upbeat about, because it suggests if there is a feeling, let's say a feeling in the water, that Labour is preferred over the Conservatives and they don't particularly know either candidate as their mayor before now, then they will start thinking that this is a good basis on which to start building seats. And as you said, when you're looking, the difference between somewhere like Thurrock and Rushmore, somewhere like Redditch and Richmond, you are seeing completely different, not just geographically different, but sort of demographically different made up places. And I think that's where Labour will take succour from tonight.
Yeah, and you're seeing in that exact way, you're seeing the 2019 coalition and even the 2021 coalition, where the Conservatives did very well when these seats were last formed, basically fall away at both ends. And we should, as part of that picture, we should just talk a little bit about Blackpool South, because as I say, I think that by the time we get to Saturday, and you might be listening to this, it will be probably forgotten, but it ought not to be forgotten, not least because, it's a striking result in and of itself. It was a Conservative seat. Scott Benson was forced to resign because of a corruption scandal, and it became Conservative in 2019. There was a huge 26% swing to Labour. That is the third biggest swing to Labour from the Conservatives in history, and we've become quite accustomed to these big swings now away from the Conservatives. But because this Parliament has had, tantalisingly, in such a fun way, so many by-elections, been great fun for all of us who, that's where we get our kicks, as partly as a result of recall petitions, if you take the long sweep of those by-elections, basically from 2021 to 22, you see a pattern that has not abated, which is huge swings away from the Conservatives under both Boris Johnson and then Rishi Sunak. Liz Truss didn't have any because, as we know, her premiership
it was only September to October.
It wasn't really time for any of that. But, initially to the Liberal Democrats, seats like Chesham and Amersham, North Shropshire, Tiverton and Honiton, huge swings of, 25, 30%. And then latterly to the Labour Party, Selby and Ainsty, 23%, Mid Beds, 20%, Tamworth, 24%, and latterly Wellingborough and now Blackpool as well. There is no sign. Rishi Sunak is fond of saying, governments get a kicking in mid-term. This is mid-term in the sense that, late November is middle of the year, right? It's not. This is towards the very fag end of this Parliament. And if there is no sign in these by-elections of at least a trend starting to close, it's just catastrophic curtains for the Conservative Party.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting about that is the effect it has in Westminster. Because, look, Ben Houchin has won. Well done, Ben Houchin. You were more popular, as Emily's pointed out, very conspicuous standing on that stage when the Labour guy's got his red rosette on. The Liberal Democrat has the orange rosette on, and Ben Houchen has no rosette on. He ran independent of the Conservative Party, just as Andy Street has done in the West Midlands. Surely Tories don't come away and say, well, look, we held Tees Valley, everything's fine for the election. Surely Tories go back to Westminster at the end of this and think it's every bit as bad as we thought it was.
It's such an interesting point, that, because for the last few months, we've been holding out this weekend, this set of elections, as the moment when, if things go really badly, those few rebels might become slightly greater in number and decide that there is still one more chance to depose Rishi Sunak. And I guess if you want that in numbers terms, anywhere up to a loss of, I guess, above 500 seats for the Conservatives starts to look not just really bad, that's more than half, but pretty catastrophic. And I've been sort of trying to get a sense of MPs who are reading the room a little bit and asking how they are feeling this sort of growing body of rebellion. And quite interesting, the first thing I was told was that they were, this is not like it's all going fine, but they said the test for their side is to stay calm and measured rather than go for the nuclear option, although some will try. And they said that they will probably be a reshuffle in due course, and that maybe the Police and Crime Commissioner results will offer more helpful intelligence as they're a bit more distant. But the other person I spoke to told me one thing that I think will be quite critical going forwards, which is that the MPs won't be meeting again until Tuesday. And on Tuesday, there is only a one-line whip. In other words, a three-line whip is when you have to be there. You have to be in the Commons, you have to be in Westminster. A one-line whip means essentially, you can stay at home if you want. So I think in sort of, like in COVID terms, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, is actually slightly saying, hands, face, space, stay at home, save the PM. The last thing we want is all the MPs gathering in one place to talk to each other. It's a bit what we saw for the Rwanda vote just before Easter, but they basically want to keep people far away for a bit longer to stop any sense of a rebellion fermenting.
Yeah, I just think that the idea of keep calm and carry on is such an interesting one because, of course, it sounds stoical. It just says we mustn't lose our heads when all around are losing theirs, etc., etc., etc. Yet, surely, the rational response is to lose your head, given, you're saying, it's November and people saying that's the middle of the year. No,
it's 2 minutes to doomsday.
It's 2 minutes to doomsday. And just to keep calm and say, no, everything is going fine. We're just the 25 points behind in the polls. Everything is going exactly to plan. Looks like it's complacent. But equally, to defenestrate another Conservative Party leader also looks like it's total lunacy.
Well, maybe let's listen to Rishi Sunak, who obviously had to respond today to what has been, a deeply disappointing night in terms of councillors, at least. This is what he said.
Obviously, it's disappointing to lose good, hard-working Conservative councillors, and I'm grateful to them for all their service in local government, keeping council tax low and delivering services for local people. But we've still got lots of results to come as well, and there are also things that I would point to.
If we're thinking about Sunak's position, we've been saying all year, basically, that these local elections were a point of maximum political peril for him. That if there were to be a challenge, surely it would come around now. What is striking, despite the fact, and these two things are true at once, despite the fact that these results are bad for the Conservative Party, they are objectively very bad, and they support all of the rest of the evidence that we've had from all the other elections that we've had, that the Conservative Party, there's been a substantial swing to Labour since 2019, and Labour, one way or another, at the very least, on their way to be the biggest party. Despite all of that, Sunak, as things stand, looks safer now than we might have thought that he would. It looks like that challenge, which rebels have been trying to orchestrate, is disappearing. And the reason for that is we've often said in the show, and I think there's some truth to it, that Rishi Sunak and Number 10 are bad at politics. You know what? To give them some credit about this, they've played the politics around expectation management for these elections in a blinding fashion. Like beautifully, because what they've done is they've channeled it all towards these mayoralties. They say, if we win these, this is fine, just look at that. And to be honest, most of the media has accepted it. And so we're in a position now where, partly as well because I think most Tory MPs do recognise that to get rid of him again without anyone having a particularly alternative prospectus would be a bad move. but they've played it pretty well.
I think that slightly flatters number 10. I think it's partly that the rebels don't really, as you say, have any focal figure to sort of rebel around. But I think if you listen to the MPs on the sort of doing the rounds this morning, the Conservatives, the message that seems to be coming through is give us time, give us time. You know, we are turning things around. We are just starting. We have just got the legislation through. You are going to feel inflation coming down. Rwanda's going to take off. The underlying message is give us time. So if anything, I would expect that election to be pushed back till, I'm going to say, December at this point, because I think if they can try and convince people that the wins are there, that nobody's in love with Labour, that, you know, it's not that Labour have won your hearts, it's just that you're a bit cross with us, give us time will be the phrase, and it might push the election back another 6 months.
There's one other factor which is buttressing, or will buttress Sunak and make him slightly safer than we might have thought he could have been, and that is again going back to Blackpool, which is reform. Reform came within 100 votes or so of knocking the Conservative Party into third place. It's only 100 votes. What does it matter? Psychologically in politics, things matters. If they'd overcome that, it would have had an extra effect. And there's a lot of talk, particularly on Twitter or over into Friday morning, about how well Reform are doing in some of these council results, particularly in places like Sunderland. And there's been a bit of that. The truth is, what we can see from these results so far is Reform are generally scoring about 6 to 7% of the vote versus the sort of 15% of the vote they're getting in the polls. So on one level, that's bad for the Conservatives because it would, even if they get 6 to 7% of the vote at the general election, it could cost them a slew of seats, in Conservative seats with narrow majorities they have against Labour. But at the same time, the fact they've not done substantially better kind of UKIP-type performance that you might have seen in the mid-2010s at least allays some of the problems around Sunak, because if they'd done spectacularly well in these elections, and it's hard for them to break through in first past the post, but if they'd done better still, it would have enhanced those voices on the right of the Conservative Party saying, we need a substantial move to the right.
Well, let's listen now to Richard Tice, the leader of the Reform Party.
What's rapidly becoming clear is basically, as more people hear us about reform, we're becoming the real opposition to the Labour Party in the North, in the Midlands, in Wales. We're on the way up, and it's quite clear that the Tories are on the way down.
Well, if you say you're becoming the real opposition to the Labour Party in some areas, isn't the electoral truth that if people vote Reform, they take votes away from the Conservative and they get Labour? So vote Reform, get Labour.
The more people who vote Reform, then the more reform we've got the opportunity to get. Look, there's no difference between the main two parties. They're variants of socialism. The highest taxes for 70 years, the highest government spending for 70 years, the worst public sector outcomes, the lowest growth per decade for 70 years, and the longest per person recession we're currently in. It's 2 years long. That's the longest per person recession for 70 years. This is an economic catastrophe, and Labour Party's plans will not achieve any economic growth whatsoever. We hear nothing on that. We've got a bold plan to make work pay. We've got an ambitious plan to get to zero waiting lists on healthcare, which is absolutely essential. So there's so many areas of British life that, frankly, need fundamental reform, and that's what we stand for.
Richard Tice there for Reform, and I think there is a rather old-fashioned assumption here that Reform doesn't want to damage the Conservatives, it only wants to damage Labour. That is ridiculous, because if you look at who Reform is comprised of, it's people who have, quite frankly, left the Conservative Party or left the Conservative Party behind, characters like Lee Anderson who got thrown out, who have, if anything, a sort of a personal vitriol towards the party that's kicked them out. They're delighted if their vote hurts the Conservatives. But I think the real question actually for Reform is when the broadcasters and the interviewers start asking them questions, not just about who's going to stand, not just about who's going to lead their party, but actually what their policies are, because we know very, very little about what their actual policies are. And come the general election, I think we do need to interrogate that slightly more firmly.
Yeah, and the other thing to say about Reform, and maybe not having done as well as kind of perhaps they had hoped, is that the game changer would be, of course, or potentially would be, if Nigel Farage says, I'm in, I'm going to lead the party.
Which he's hinting at once
Which
again.
he's hinting again. But it's an endless tantalise, isn't it? It's an endless kind of means of getting publicity without actually necessarily getting your hands dirty in the process. But we have talked about already on this podcast how you have got mayors in various places around the country that are much more popular than their parties. And you just wonder whether actually Farage re-entering the fray in a central role might do it for reform. We'll be back after the break.
Right, so we have covered, in a way, what went really well for Labour overnight. And as we've said, we should underscore that lots of things did go well. There were some problems, though. And we've referred to a couple of them already, which is the mayoral contest. Obviously, they've lost Tees Valley. Ben Houchin, resounding sort of personal victory for him, winning an absolute majority, 53% of the vote. I mean, I've been speaking to Labour sources in the West Midlands all morning who are pretty pessimistic about the West Midlands mayoral contest, Andy Street and Richard Parker. We can get into some of the reasons for that. And there are individual councils across the country, places like Oldham, Blackburn, etc., and some of the big cities as well, where you can start to see a significant attrition of the Labour vote, in particular in areas with large Muslim populations. And indeed, as this Birmingham Labour source put it to me, if we lose in the West Midlands, it is largely going to be, well, partly it's going to be of Street's personal popularity, but a key factor will be around the Gaza war and Labour, and in particular, Keir Starmer's initial reaction to the Gaza war, which is suppressing the Muslim vote in seats and areas which have large Muslim populations.
Yeah, and that is something that, we talked about that after the Rochdale by-election when George Galloway won his sort of famous victory and kind of, was on the rampage, it seemed, about how Labour had let the Muslim population down in this country. The question, I guess, is how much does that translate into a general election? How many parliamentary seats are vulnerable for Labour because of that sizable Muslim population? I mean, I can think of probably half a dozen,
Not
a dozen. And so I don't know whether how much of a problem or how much that should concern Keir Starmer. I mean, it will concern him a bit, and the situation in Gaza is not doing him any favours at all, whereas it doesn't seem to be hurting the Conservative Party at all.
Well, there are several key shadow cabinet ministers. Shabana Mahmood is one, Wes Streeting is another. There are others as well who have constituencies with big Muslim populations, and there is doubtless concern within the Labour Party about the effect that the Gaza war is having in terms of an attrition on the Labour vote, and not just for this general election, but in the future as well. I mean, you're right, John. There aren't that many seats where it could be absolutely crucial in a general election, and the fact of the matter is as well, right now, the size of the Labour lead overall is so massive that it doesn't matter that much because you're basically getting compensating factors from other bits of the population. But there are those around Keir Starmer and there are those within the Labour Party who are saying, in a sort of post-general election situation, if we haven't done something to try and recover, the Muslim vote is a big part of the Labour coalition. And it's not just Muslims as well, we should say. It's other people who are concerned about the Gaza war and are unhappy with the Labour Party's reaction to it. You can see the kind of seeds being sown for a politics of discontent with a Labour government that could become a problem, if not now for the general election, because the overall poll lead is so big, then in the future.
Yeah, there was real pushback actually from one Labour source who was reported to say, if we lose the West Midlands, it will be the Middle East, not the West Midlands. And that was deemed to be, sort of a racist assumption that everyone living around the Birmingham area was more interested in Gaza than what was happening on their streets. But I think when you actually look at the breakdown, and the places where there are highest Muslim populations, you are seeing that Labour vote heard. It is down 16%. The Greens are picking up 14%, which suggests that maybe people are going to the Greens this time round in those sorts of places, but for a protest vote, simply because they don't like what is happening within the Labour Party on that one issue. Now, the curious thing is that Labour's not really fighting this. They're saying, yeah, we know we have to win back trust amongst our left, essentially. And that is, I suppose, what's really interesting about Keir Starmer's whole philosophy over the last 6 months, maybe a year. It's all been about wrapping yourself in the flag, talking about patriotism, not scaring the horses, not talking about spending money too much, not going really hard on big green issues. Maybe he has forgot his left flank, and that is going to be more evident in the months ahead. And I think what's interesting is that you now hear the sort of, the Labour pundits coming out and saying, just to remind you, we did vote for a ceasefire, just to remind you, and they will give you the entire wording of that ceasefire motion that was in the Commons last month, because they think that they have gone as far as they could go. They think they've gone pretty much to where George Galloway would go, but nobody's heard it. Nobody has actually heard that change. And so they're kind of thinking, is this a comms problem, or is it just people kind of like Galloway trying to make political capital after the fact that they were a bit late?
But then again, in terms of the kind of split between mayors who are being re-elected and those who haven't, I mean, as we're sat here, we find out that Labour has won North Yorks, the new North Yorkshire mayoralty, which includes quite literally...
Whose constituency?
I believe it is an occupant of number 10 Downing Street, John.
Yeah.
And, you know, at the start of this campaign, I think a lot of people would have thought that would be a long shot for the Labour Party. And this is one of the really interesting things about these mayoralties, right, is as we've touched on already with the East Midlands, is that it looks like, and maybe we can touch on London at the end, because there are some pretty fetid rumours going on around London, but it looks like probably that every incumbent mayor who is standing for re-election is going to get re-elected, that they will win again. In places where there are no incumbents, you're seeing the pattern being more typical to the national polling. And there is something, I think, about the kind of institutions of the institution of these mayoralties that's interesting, that they become so synonymous with their areas. They do become Mr. or Mrs., you know, like North Yorkshire or Manchester or Liverpool or London or wherever it happens to be, West Midlands. They become so synonymous with the politics and just kind of regional identity of their areas that they do, as George Osborne wanted to do when he created them, they kind of end up transcending party lines, and they do get a big incumbency factor in a way that other politicians, particularly MPs, simply don't.
It'll be really interesting to see, when we get all the results tomorrow, if every incumbent mayor has won their race, and that you've got no change whatsoever, and yet you've got this febrile atmosphere in politics in Britain, across Europe, where no government can win re-election.
More like the US, actually. We're starting to develop that split ticket type voting that we never really had before.
We've never had that before in British politics. But you love your mayor. He seems to be a good guy. He blames it on the government, banging the drum for you. And it's great for charismatic political figures to be out there doing their stuff. And you can see that the incumbency factor is really strong. Whereas in general elections, you could have the most fantastic constituency MP, but if the tide is running against your party, it's not going to save you.
Not enough people know who they are. And also, I mean, you could put one of the slightly less charitable interpretation as well, is that you could say as well, like, actually these mayors, particularly outside London, at the moment they've got a lot of authority. They've got a lot of influence. They've got a lot of profile. They don't actually have that much power. They can't actually be directly blamed for that much, right? In a way that the council can, MP to some extent, certainly the government. They want more power, by the way, so it's not like they're happy with this. But it does mean that they kind of get a lot of the benefits of the notoriety without some of the traditional drawbacks of incumbency.
I suppose the one thing we haven't spoken about that much yet on this podcast is the Liberal Democrats. And normally on kind of local council election nights, you talk endlessly about the Liberal Democrats because of the sweeping gains that they've made in all these councils.
Normally Ed Davey would have turned up somewhere, smashing a massive blue wall down with a comedy mallet.
Exactly. And that hasn't happened. And I wonder whether that is an underperformance on the Liberal Democrats, or whether it's just that the places where the Liberal Democrats are going to do really well haven't declared yet.
I think it is that. Well, I should just say that we're recording this at 2:30 this afternoon. It's always hard to try and find the right sort of zone where you're not too late and you're not too early, because this is, as I think we said, a 3-day affair at least. It's basically like a big fancy royal wedding. And at any one point in time, you can find a very different narrative. But I think we are going to hear more from the Greens and more from the Lib Dems the later it gets this afternoon.
Greens have had generally very good local election results over multiple cycles now, and you can see them. They're going to do the same this time. And the Lib Dems, look, they think, if you talk to them internally, they think that, again, where it matters, come the general election, when you've got efficient tactical voting, that they'll be able to score, 20, 30 seats. I mean, who knows? There is a general concern for Lib Dems, and this is more for the general election than the locals probably, the damage the post office scandal did with Ed Davey, and the fact he ended up being associated with it at that time, fairly or unfairly or whatever. But there is a sort of, I was talking to a Labour person not long ago about this, they were saying they thought that the Lib Dems would be a bigger factor in their calculations right now than they might have been, and they don't feel they are. Maybe that'll change between now and the general election, but they've sort of slightly gone into the background.
The other thing we haven't spoken about yet is a result which comes tomorrow, Saturday, which is the result of who is going to be Mayor of London. And of course, that is the most powerful, directly elected person in Britain. because actually Sadiq Khan does have some...
Biggest mandate in Europe.
Biggest mandate, yeah. And Sadiq Khan does have real powers. And I think that there was an assumption in London that Sadiq Khan was going to cruise this. Susan Hall was a kind of pretty cranky, kind of odd candidate to have for the Conservatives. And yet last night I was picking up all sorts of people in a state of some panic on the Labour side thinking, we may not have this. We don't know. And a real fear and terror going round that Sadiq Khan could lose.
It would be astounding if Khan lost. I mean, I was talking to a Conservative London person today, and they didn't think it was going to happen. They did think that, and did point out, which is true, it is actually quite hard to poll London for different reasons. It's such a complex, diverse place, and so big, and so electorally complicated that the weightings have to be really precise and so on. But it would basically, if she won, if Susan Hall won, despite the fact that her campaign was pretty threadbare, got very little support from CCHQ, it would represent one of the biggest polling errors in British political history. There will be, I think, this person was also saying, which I think is true, is that it is true to say that for all sorts of reasons, Khan was a frail candidate. I mean, he was, third, he was looking for a third term, hasn't happened before. There was ULEZ, you can say it's politically courageous, whatever, but it was clearly very unpopular in outer London boroughs. There is the Gaza issue, maybe a little bit less pronounced because he's Sadiq Khan and it would be in the Midlands, but that's there as well. So if they had run a better candidate, and it's closer to the Tories, that is, and it is closer than people assumed, there will be a bit of an inquest within CCHQ saying we could have won this. And imagine how much it would shake the Labour Party if they had beaten Sadiq Khan.
Well, if Sadiq Khan does lose and Susan Hall is the next Mayor of London, I think we three will be together again tomorrow for an unscheduled podcast. Such will be the political upheaval of that electoral move.
We love to keep you guessing because we know there's nothing genuinely that you appreciate more than an emergency podcast, as indeed we all do. And talking about emergencies, one of the strangest exchanges of, I'm going to say the night, but it was in fact the morning, was between Joe Coburn of the BBC and Andrea Leadsom over that Tory success of Ben Houchen. And I'm going to say something I wasn't expecting to, which is that the Tories, senior Tories, are starting to sound just genuinely hurt by the electorate. I mean, hurt in a very emotional sort of time to go to bed way. Just listen to Andrea unable to take Joe, who is just literally giving her the results, at her word.
This win is down to his personal popularity, Andrea. That must be worrying.
So I think that whole little bit of discussion is absolutely pathetic from the BBC. This is a superb... you and Vicky.
Yeah, no, but no
that
one,
is
no
pathetic.
One is
He's won. All you're saying is he's had this big swing away from him.
Big indignation.
No, I'm sorry. No, I am indignant. Yes, you are.
No one is taking away from Ben Houchen.
Harry's just tried to suggest he's had a $3 billion bung from the Treasury.
Well, he has.
This is all credit to a mayor who's done an absolutely brilliant job in a key part of the levelling up agenda for this government.
Under pressure,
this is an absolute testament to the Conservative government and to the levelling up agenda that have backed Ben Houchen, and it is absolute testament to him as a good Conservative, his focus on his area, his support for his communities in negotiating to win, to apply for the funding that is available for the levelling up programme.
You've made your speech, but actually we can show exactly why it's not down necessarily to the Conservative government.
If you can't lose your on election night, when can you, for God's sake?
And let's be honest, we've all done it.
We may or may not be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.